Go ahead, Attorney June.
Yes, oo. Ano na tayo? Tuloy na tayo. After Alan's welcome remarks, we're now ready to kick off our discussions for this conference.
Yes,
Pat,
sir.
yes.
Opo, but before we begin with our first keynote presentation, ay nakatanggap po ako ng advice that we would
Yes.
like to get a group photo first. Di ba,
Mm-hmm.
good morning po sa lahat. Nakaayos ba tayo? All right, thank you. We will now proceed to our first keynote presentation. Our first keynote speaker is Mr. David Fairman. Mr. Fairman has been a longtime friend and supporter of MedNet. In 2004, he introduced conflict mapping through a training he conducted for MedNet. Since then, conflict mapping has been one of the integral strategies being used by MedNet and its trained mediators. Mr. Fairman is the managing director at the Consensus Building Institute and the associate director of the MIT Harvard Public Disputes Program. He is a facilitator, a mediator, capacity builder, and researcher on the use of collaborative approaches to resolve complex public issues. With 20 years of experience in the US, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Mr. Fairman will be discussing mediation in these critically challenging times via pre-recorded presentation.
Good morning, colleagues in the Philippines, and magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. I'm so sorry not to have the chance to be with you in person, but very grateful to MedNet, to Che and colleagues for the chance to talk with you. And I have a great association with MedNet dating back more than 20 years, and I'm so glad to see the organization still thriving and working on important issues. Today, my task is to talk to you about the challenge of polarization in my society, in your society, and so many of our societies, and to offer some thoughts about what we as mediators might be able to contribute. So let me begin by acknowledging that I'm a long way from the Philippines, and I'm not as current on current issues in politics as I was a decade ago. So much of what I'm going to offer is from our experience in the United States, from the experience of my organization, the Consensus Building Institute, and the field of public mediation that I know in the US, and also experiences in other countries around the world. And I'll try to say some things that are relevant to the Philippines as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what's driving political polarization, some similarities and differences maybe between how it's working in the Philippines and the United States, and then to offer some thoughts about how we can even think about our role in these extremely complex and challenging times, and some thoughts on strategies that I think we can use, most of which is not new, but which I think is as relevant or more relevant than it's ever been because of the challenges of increasing polarization that we face. And then to end on a fairly ambitious note, I want to offer some thoughts about what more we can do in our roles in our societies. So to start, let's just acknowledge that we've got a challenge of political polarization in our societies, and that it's in many ways driven by the fragmentation of our media, in some ways of the culture of communication in our democracies. There's a great new book out by a political scientist named Sean Illig in the United States, who talks about democracy as a communicative culture. And when that culture's modes of communications shift, often because of new technologies, that can actually create real political change. And I think the rise of social media has done just that. It's not the only thing, but it matters. But deeper, and I think very significant, is the reality of inequity and economic insecurity in basically every advanced economy and in every other society, middle income and low income around the world. The trends over the last couple of generations in many societies in the West, in the OECD, have been toward greater inequality and toward greater economic insecurity for the majority of people. So it's a very significant factor, and I think it is driving some of what we're experiencing as translated into politics. And then underlying all of that is the extraordinary global pace of change in our economy, in our societies, and in the environment. And we have experienced in our collective history periods maybe from the 1850s to the early 1900s, where change was arguably as dramatic and as disruptive. And that didn't go very well. Arguably, it led fairly directly to the conditions that started the First World War, and then the after effects that led to the Second World War. I think we're handling the pace of change much better now, but it's not at all clear that we really have the institutions, either nationally or globally, to deal with the pace of change and the dynamics of change that we're now experiencing. I just want to offer a couple of sort of supporting points from the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's a good source of cross-national comparisons on how people see their lives, the place of government and business and civil society in their societies. And in this slide, you'll see these questions about the role of government in the media. And in the 24 countries that were surveyed, you'll see a net negative for both government and media, seen overall as more divisive than they are as unifying. And although business and NGOs still are net positive, it's a pretty daunting situation when government and the media, two really critical pillars of any society's politics, are seen as more divisive than they are as unifying. If there were any institution in society that we say should have the job of bringing people together, it would probably be government. It's not necessarily the media's job to unify, but I think part of what's being pointed at here is the fragmentation of media and the inability to create a common story through the media about what happened, about what society's values are, what we should want. So even though there's greater freedom of speech than there ever has been before, it's also clear that that freedom of speech and the diversity of media is leading to more fragmentation in our views than ever before. And not surprisingly, this leads large majorities of people across all these 24 countries, and presumably most others, to say that they are very concerned about the impact of fake news, of disinformation and misinformation in the media being used to score political points and to manipulate people. So we have a really, really challenging situation. And Edelman, I think, does a good job of summarizing this in a simple diagram that says what we have right now are government and media, not equally everywhere, but in many places in somewhat parallel ways, contributing to division and contributing to the spread of, I would say, both misinformation, that is, people who are just being inaccurate, as well as disinformation, which is the active choice to spread things that are not true. I would also say that from my standpoint, I'm not sure I would use the word government there as much as I would politicians. And the problem for political leaders today is that it's very hard to get attention if you're not being divisive. We've shifted from an era in which the way to get attention and support was to be more or less likable, to an era in which the way to get attention and support is to be very tribal, to pull together a group in your favor and to have a group that's your enemy and bring together a critical mass of people in your society around that us and them mindset. And business and NGOs are a bit caught in the middle here, trying in many ways to work, at least from the NGO standpoint, on some of these challenging social issues. Business obviously trying to make profit, but also looking for a stable environment in which to conduct business and not finding one. So it's a hard time as a broad brush. Let me just offer a couple of thoughts about the US and the Philippines, just for the sake of clarifying that, of course, every country has its own story, and that Edelman diagram is not a bad start, but it needs to be carefully calibrated to each society's own dynamics. So in the United States, over the last couple of generations, we've actually had slowing growth in our GDP per capita. The Philippines, actually since about 2000 and even more so since 2010, has had pretty steadily rising growth, GDP per capita. In the United States, we have a clear situation of the rich getting richer and everyone else getting more insecure. In the Philippines, interestingly, and granted that not everyone sees it this way, I'm just talking here about World Bank statistics. It appears that income inequality has actually been shrinking over the last 10, 15 years, but from a very, very unequal start. So the top 20% have got a little bit less share of income, down from, I think, above 55% to about 48%. And the bottom 20% are up from something like 4 to something like 9. But it's still, of course, a dramatic inequality. In terms of how this translates into political culture, of course, in the United States, we have very, very strong distrust and anger against our government from left and right, and against politicians. We also have just a lot of exhaustion and cynicism about politics. In the Philippines, at least if you read the Social Weather Service results, and I'll share some of those with you, actually, it seems like most people think both of the last two presidents were pretty good, which is kind of counterintuitive considering how different they were from each other, and a pretty fair amount of optimism about the future. In the United States, politics is very much driven now by polarization between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. And unfortunately, it's gotten to a point where if I know nothing else about you than your political identity, and yours is different from mine, I'm probably going to assume that I'm not going to like you, and vice versa, which is a terrible place for us to be. And of course, those identities also drive our voting behavior. In the Philippines, it seems that it's a more complex picture. Of course, political parties in the Philippines are much less clear and strong drivers of political identity. And personalities and patronage are still very strong in motivating voting behavior and political behavior. So all of this is just to say that I think there is an important set of situational differences that are good to keep in mind for our two societies, and that maybe should influence some of our views about what kind of polarization we're talking about, how significant it is, and what our opportunities are to work with it. Just to show quickly here, this really striking set of findings from the Social Weather Station around Aquino and Duterte, the sort of jump in satisfaction after the difficult Arroyo years. And, say what you will about either of them, and particularly about Duterte, who is the more controversial of the two, the net approval rating stayed very high. And even if we drill down a little bit more into some of the substance of the national government's actions beyond the president into the policy domain, it's clear that actually both of them have gotten relatively good marks on things like helping the poor. Duterte's campaign against illegal drugs, very controversial, but still very popular. But then you see the drop off under Duterte around corruption and around inflation. And so that's a more worrisome endpoint for that administration and start point for your new administration. But it is to say that it's not a small thing that over the last decade in the Philippines, people have felt that a lot of things in the country were going okay or even well. And I think that's something to build on and not take too lightly, even if many on the educated left, and I certainly would account myself one of them, might have really strong feelings about someone like Duterte, as I do about Donald Trump. It's, I think, very important to keep in mind what's the broader public context in which we're working, especially as public issue mediators. Let's then turn more specifically to our stance on polarization and how we might deal with it in our work, trying to bring stakeholders together to resolve challenging issues, whether at the community level, at the policy level, at the national political level. One stance we can take is, listen, I work in the world as it is. That is, whoever is in charge, whoever's been elected more or less legitimately to lead the country or to lead the province or the community, municipality, I'm going to work with whoever that is. And I'm going to work with people in business, and I'm going to work with community leaders, and I'm not going to judge anybody's values or views. I'm going to play my role, do my job as a mediator, and take what's presented to me and try to help them make progress. A very different stand would just be to say, because I'm so concerned about what the actual substantive outcomes might be, I'm going to pass on mediating on issues where I feel very uncomfortable with the framing of the issue. So in my case, or my organization's case, had we had the opportunity to respond to a request to mediate policy making on deportation of immigrants in the United States under the Trump administration, we might very well have passed on that opportunity and said, we're not going to do that because we don't think that there's any decision that could come out of this that would be a good one from our standpoint, no matter how good the representation around the table was. A third stance that we could take is to put issues of equity and fairness very clearly on the table and to make it explicit for the stakeholders that they need to respond on the questions of fairness and justice as part of the dialogue, and that part of our job is actually to directly engage their values, as divided and divisive as they may be, and to help them make some progress. Just to say, we recently facilitated a dialogue on guns and suicide in the United States. And as you know, I think the issue of gun ownership and gun rights in the United States is tremendously divisive on the left and right. But the stakeholders that were brought together were able to come to some very important agreements on reducing the risk that guns will be used for people to commit suicide, which is actually the single biggest cause of death by gun in the United States. The number one use of guns to cause death is suicide. So it's heartening to see that you can make progress across these divisions. And this was not done by saying that there was a right answer to begin with, but it was done by really putting squarely on the table the value question. Does anyone disagree that we should try to reduce the use of guns for suicide? And that was the stand from the start. Finally, we could actively advocate for fair outcomes. Beyond putting the question on the table, we could say, when we are mediating, we are not simply leaving it to the stakeholders to decide what they collectively think is fair or just or right. We are actually speaking up on behalf of those who have been historically disempowered, even if they are in some sense at the table. Or we're speaking up for the environment, even if there is environmental NGO representation at the table, or the environment DENRs at the table. We as mediators are saying we think this is very important. That last, I want to acknowledge, is a challenging place for a mediator to be. I know that there are some increasingly activist mediators in the United States who are, I would say, experimenting with very, very strong stands on outcomes. And I think some of what happens is that you basically aren't selected to mediate stuff because people see you say that you're not impartial. And so it becomes a little bit of a puzzle. How are you going to mediate that? But I acknowledge that this is a stand that's out there, and I'm not prepared to say that it's wrong. I'm just acknowledging all four of these as stands that we can take to deal with the level of polarization that we're facing. From my own perspective, I absolutely think we do need to be guided by our values as mediators. I think that along with our commitment to good process, which clearly should include effective representation of both lower power and higher power stakeholders at the table, and efforts to support those who've been historically marginalized to have effective voice and as much influence as is possible without pretending that we can fundamentally change the balance of power away from the table. I think we have this responsibility to address these things squarely. But in my case, and I think in my organization's case, without actually taking a side, without saying that for example, in a recent set of issues around Native Americans and their rights with regard to Indian schools, that our stand as mediators was not the Bureau of Indian Affairs owes Native Americans this outcome, but rather to be very, very strong in ensuring that the Native American representatives in that process had very effective representation and had all the information that they needed and were able to organize away from the table as well. More fundamentally, and I think this is where I get ambitious and optimistic, and I own that and I acknowledge it, and I am, I think, a bit encouraging you to take this on yourself, is to stand for the possibility that the stakeholders actually can surprise themselves across power differences, across very polarized political views, across histories of inequality and injustice, and still go from us and them to become a we through an effective mediated process. And I've seen this many times. I've had the very great privilege to mediate between advocates for charter schools and private schools and advocates for public schools and teacher unions in one of the most divisive issues in American politics, which is the way that public education is run, and to see the stakeholders transform their relationships and change their views on what's the right way to think about the outcomes we want to achieve in education, and to become partners in launching new initiatives and a whole new paradigm, really, about the future of education in my country. So I just want to emphasize that I think this is possible, and I want to say that we have the tools and we can use them even in very polarized situations, not to guarantee or wave a magic wand that this transformation will happen, but to help the stakeholders change their mindsets about what's possible, about how they relate to each other, and through that to achieve some breakthroughs in collaboration. Without going into great depth, I just want to be a little bit more specific about what I mean when I say we can help them shift mindsets. So I think first and fundamentally is this shift from we're right, they're wrong, and we don't have any responsibility for what happened, they do, to a learning mindset where we start to become curious. Okay, so there was a terrible accident at the mine, and that caused people harm. So we need to get into the conversation about how that happened and understand it and do that in good faith, and then move from there to the question of what can we do both to compensate for the harm that happened and how we can make sure or maximize the chances that it does not happen again. But that's a huge shift from defense of ourselves and accusation of them to an actual willingness to explore and learn together. Second, and very familiar to all of you who work with negotiation processes and an effort to promote integrative or mutual gains negotiation, trying to get from the position we want to clarify the underlying interests and to become creative in finding ways to achieve joint gains. Third, and very important in this context that we're talking about today around polarization, from believing that not only are they wrong, but they are bad and we are good, to acknowledging that they have strongly held views and values that are different from ours, but are legitimate. Doesn't mean that we think they're right, but we can honestly say we see why you believe what you believe. and we're willing to work with you in dialogue, even though we believe something very different. One of my colleagues was very successful over a number of years in promoting dialogue between pro-life and pro-choice advocates in Boston. And through that dialogue, helping them come to a point where they actually ended up jointly advocating for a whole set of ways to minimize the possibility or the risk that unwanted children would be born without resorting to abortion. They focused on all kinds of counseling opportunities and intervention opportunities with the people who are most likely to be at risk, mostly young adults, teenagers and young adults. And again, this shift in mindset was the basis on which they were then able to get to concrete action together. And finally, just to acknowledge the shift from being driven primarily by negative emotions to being driven to find emotionally intelligent, as Dan Goleman would say, ways to engage. And without belaboring this point, I think we've all seen what happens when people actually develop relationships that are friendship in a process like this. In the work that we did on the future of public education in the United States, from the first couple of meetings when we had absolutely people shouting at each other and people declaring that they were prepared to leave the process, we got to a point where leaders of both of the main teachers unions and some of the strongest advocates for charter schools and private schools became friends and close friends. And that was a really remarkable transformation that reflected the work that they had done together on these other shifts. So just to acknowledge what we're, I think, trying to achieve, and then just to say a little bit about the tools that we have. And I'm not going to say anything here that I think is radical, but we have been doing some thinking at CBI, my organization, about the balance between the negotiation process and other things that are very important in order to achieve the kind of transformation that we're talking about here. So trust building is fundamental. And we have many, many tools for doing it. I just want to raise up here storytelling and acknowledging history, something that I think is often used by colleagues that I know in the Philippines, to let people tell their stories. When we brought together Muslim Americans and people who were very conservative after 9/11 to have dialogue about what policies the United States should have toward the global Muslim community and also toward Muslim Americans, we had some fantastic storytelling, both by Muslim Americans in the group and by a gentleman who was at that time the head of the Southern Baptist Convention's policy arm, who was deeply conservative and deeply distrustful of what impact Muslim Americans might be having in our society. And that storytelling really opened up space. The gentleman from the Southern Baptists, heard stories that I think moved him and shifted his perspective. And I think a number of the Muslim American participants were moved by his account of his own upbringing and his experiences and why they had made him such a strong Christian and a strong patriot in his eyes. So the second thing I think that matters a lot for achieving these shifts in mindset is creativity. And basically, the more polarized we are, the more likely we are to be stuck and to not find any possibility of a solution that could work for us and for them. And we need to get unstuck. So again, we have many tools that we can use. One that we used in the reimagining of education in America was skits, where we asked the participants to break into small groups and show us through a skit, a little play, a mini play, a day in the life of a student 25 years in the future, if that student was having a fantastic learning experience that day. And those skits were a pivot point for the entire process, because the participants discovered through their skits that they talked about in small groups and didn't talk about across the small groups, an extraordinary thread of commonality in all of their presentations, which was how learner-centered they were. They put the learner at the center and gave the learner a lot of agency and choice. And that became the starting point for their new thinking about the future of education. Of course, we need negotiation. I'm not going to say very much about that, simply to acknowledge that if we're trying to get these breakthroughs in collaboration, at some point, we've got to get to the quite substantive issues. And when we do get to the substantive issues, we're going to need to figure out options that could be workable and to make wise trade-offs, to work with the constituencies away from the table so that the people at the table who are experiencing the wonderful relationship building and the use of creativity don't leave their constituencies behind. And there certainly is that risk. So we have to think about that very carefully. And the more progressive, the more dramatic the transformation that is happening at the table, the more we have to integrate the negotiation process with continuing communication with the constituencies that are being represented. And finally, joint action. And that doesn't have to wait until everything has been agreed. Joint fact-finding can be a very important form of joint action. Walking the site to figure out where are the boundaries of traditional domains, as I know many of you do in your work on ancestral domain, but also doing things like finding the resources to get into an exploration of possibilities. A project that I did a number of years ago on redesigning a bridge that was a horrible design going across the Charles River in Boston, brought in a fantastic architect from Switzerland who had genius ideas about how to make that bridge design much better. And the stakeholders worked together to identify that person and to bring him in, and they agreed to have him be their main resource for the redesign process. So all of which is to say that the dynamics of breakthroughs in collaboration require, I think, all four of these elements to be used. I would offer trust building, creativity, negotiation, and joint action as ingredients to be used for recipes that you yourselves have to concoct. There isn't a blueprint or a clear step-by-step way that I would say in every case you have to go this step, then this step. Sometimes trust building absolutely has to come first. Sometimes trust building actually only comes through the negotiation process. Sometimes you're going to need a lot of creativity at the beginning to get people unstuck. Sometimes you're going to discover 3/4 of the way through that this is the challenge you need to meet. In the context of highly polarized and charged issues and stakeholders, I would say that these four elements working together effectively can, not will, but can become a powerful set of enablers for those shifts in mindset to allow the progress on the substance despite the polarization. But you yourselves are going to have to be the ones to figure out the best way to deploy them. Finally, I want to close by talking for a couple of minutes about where we might go from here, we being the profession of mediators who focus on public issues, and in particular, what more we might be able to do at the societal level to be ambitious about our role in society. And you collectively, all of you participating in this MedNet conference, you are a constituency and you can have a shared public voice. And I encourage you to think about ways to do that and ways to apply it, for example, to the education system. I know that a number of you do work in the domain of education, and I think it would be fantastic to deeply integrate skills of collaboration across difference into the education system in the Philippines. We have tried to do this in various ways in the United States. There's now a kind of a rebirth of civics education in the US, and those in my profession are working hard to ensure that there are what's called social emotional skills integrated with that civics curriculum. Maybe you're already far ahead of me in the Philippines, but I think it's very important. It's perhaps the most important planting of seeds. But then among adults, the opportunities for people-to-people engagement. And in the United States, we're working right now on an initiative with some of the biggest volunteer organizations in the country, the Red Cross, the YMCA, an organization called Habitat for Humanity that builds houses, to imagine ways that they can use the opportunity that volunteering creates for people who come from very different backgrounds and political perspectives to do something together that they believe in. So we can build a house together. We can help these people out of this tornado that they have to recover from together, to, along with that great work, create some opportunity for conversation and exploration of their life stories, get a little bit of openness to recognizing differences in perspective without making this into a volunteer experience that becomes an encounter group. That's not what we're trying to do, but to really open up more space. And this can also happen in faith communities. It can happen in sports, community sports teams. One of the best arenas for teams that cut across all kinds of lines of difference to become actually bridges. Because if we're rooting for the same team, even though we have very different political views, that can be a very powerful unifier. We started by talking about the social and news media and how dysfunctional they have become. I want to acknowledge that in the Philippines, I think there's some real questions now about freedom of expression that are making things even harder. But I think we in our profession have an opportunity to engage with people in the news media and in social media about trying to make those information ecosystems less divisive and healthier. In the United States, there's an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network that is bringing together editors and publishers and reporters who are motivated to tell stories with more complexity and to focus as much on solutions as on problems in their journalism. And it's a very important, I think, step toward a healthier set of information ecosystems. There are lots of questions about what can be done to break through filter bubbles online. I don't think anyone has fully cracked that yet. We are working on this issue in the United States. I think it's critically important in the Philippines as well. And I think engaging the social media platforms, the major platforms that are available, to see how you can shape their thinking about less divisive ways to operate those algorithms, I think that would be terrific. And finally, maybe most ambitiously, but I'm not even sure that's true, at the level of political leadership, are there opportunities? I'm talking about the municipal level, the provincial level, as well as the national or the federal level, to help political leaders work across differences. We recently had the opportunity to work with members of Congress who were committed in some sense to bipartisanship, to working across the Republican-Democrat divide, but who were deeply divided in their responses to the acts of January 6th, the day that the Capitol was stormed by an angry mob. And we had the opportunity to work a little bit with them to help them have a healthy conversation about January 6th and how they wanted those events to influence or not the work that they did together going forward. We've also had the opportunity to do some work at the community level in communities that were very divided about their own future on issues like renewable energy. Would this community be one where wind turbines were going to be sited? Where, again, this became, because of how polarized and divisive our society is, you can't talk about wind turbines in the United States without talking about Democrats and Republicans and, you know, whether the government is for you or against you. And so there, again, at a more local level, we had the opportunity to work with political leaders. This has been true in several communities, to help them figure out how they could be constructive in the face of this polarization and to help their communities at least come together for constructive dialogue and see if they could bridge some divides before taking a vote. And in general, when political leaders do that work well, they gain political points. They gain credibility for finding a way forward that actually works for a larger majority than the most polarizing option. So I offer these as maybe a little bit of encouragement, maybe a little bit of challenge, to think about the ways in which you all individually, in your organizations, and even collectively as a profession, can engage your society to find some countervailing positive forces to deal with the dynamics of polarization. I hope that at a minimum, I've given you some food for thought, and that if I've said anything that you found unhelpful, I apologize. And if there's anything here that's helpful for you, I'm glad. I, again, regret not being able to be there for the conversation. I hope to hear back from colleagues at MedNet about how it went. I wish you a very successful conference, and I wish you especially success in your ongoing work. So, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Be well, be good, and I hope to be in touch with you again. Thank you.
All right, maraming salamat din po, Mr. David Fairman. Unfortunately, we will not be having a Q&A with Mr. Fairman, but on that note, we would like to invite our audience to please share their thoughts, feedback, or comments in our comment section. While waiting, habang naghihintay po tayo, Attorney June, ikaw muna ang tatanungin ko. Ano po sa tingin ninyo ang pinaka-highlight or pinaka-key takeaway nyo from Mr. David Fairman's presentation?
Well, that was a very, very powerful presentation. Marami siyang sinabi, and he was basically talking about the situation in the United States. And for a while, I thought he was talking about the Philippines. No, I think this is the new world order. No, unang-una, and ang dami kong takeaway sa kanya, but I think I would like to emphasize four, because these are the four things that actually struck me the most, because these are also my concerns. First was his comment there that we are activist mediators. So we're not just mediators, we're activist mediators. And therefore, as such, we represent a certain set of values. I remember one reading I had, no, I think it was William Ury, who talks about who talked about the third party in mediation. There is his insistence is that there is always a third party in any mediation, and that is the portion of public good, the public welfare, no, like environment. Kapag nag-uusap ang mga tao sa isang mediation or negotiation, they talk about their own interests, but who represents the public good, no? So I think that's what, for me, that's what an activist mediator does. Okay. The second one that struck me in his presentation was the role of that media plays, no, in society and in the mediation process. And I relate this with his call for a healthy conversation, both at the local, the community, and the societal levels. The fourth one that struck me was his call for education, no, to the inclusion of good, sound, healthy conversations amongst people in our educational system. I think that has been one of the things that's playing in our mind now in MedNet. But it's dami pa. I think we would like to invite our participants to join in this conversation through our chat box. Already may mga pumapasok na rito. Yeah. In the four quadrants, Cesar Villanueva says, in the four quadrants of David, I wish may expand ang third quadrant to move beyond negotiation, which can just end in a compromise, to reflective dialogue, which is a safer space for we thinking towards possible joint projects. Why not? Okay. Good diagram for negotiation process, according to Ariel de la Cruz of EDC. I hope more people will give their comments.
We have a comment here from Ray of Ideals. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Truly insightful. Gives a more creative spin to how we could use our complementary strengths to engage across divides. Thank you for that comment.